Champagne glasses rang out under golden light. 300 guests watched a bride spin once more in her white gown, laughing at her own reflection. Outside, in the same freezing rain, her older sister crouched behind a potted evergreen with a swollen jaw, dialing a number she had sworn 3 years ago she would never call again. The man who answered wasn't a rescuer anyone would call first. He was a mafia boss half of Boston was too afraid to say no to. But tonight, he was the only person who wouldn't ask her what she'd done to deserve the bruises. "Can you come get me?" Freezing rain had been falling over the eastern courtyard of the country club in Brookline, Massachusetts since sundown on the night of November 14th. Inside the ballroom, golden light spilled across 300 guests and champagne glasses rang out while Hope Ellis spun once more in her white wedding gown, laughing at her own reflection in the floor-length mirrors. Outside, in that same freezing rain, her older sister stood shivering in the dark. Nyla Price's dusty rose bridesmaid dress had torn along the thigh, the silk streaked with mud. Her jaw had already begun to swell, and a thin line of dried blood traced the corner of her mouth. She did not cry out. She had learned over many quiet years exactly how to stand still when it hurt the most. An older woman, a close friend of Nyla's mother, stepped outside for a cigarette, tugging Nyla gently by the arm and murmuring just loud enough to be heard over the rain. "That dress looks a little tight through the hips, doesn't it, honey? I'd hate for you to throw off the photos for Hope's big day." The woman wasn't finished. She turned as though delivering the most ordinary observation in the world. "Your mother says if you'd just lose a little more weight, maybe next year you'd finally find someone who wants a wedding of your own." It was Nyla understood in that instant, never only about Marlon. The quiet contempt for her body had lived inside her own family for years, dressed up as concern, handed down at every holiday like a family recipe nobody dared refuse. Nyla only smiled, politely nodded, and answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'll stand toward the back." Her dignity kept her from arguing, even as both her hands curled into fists so tight her knuckles went white. The glass door swung open hard. Marlon Griffin stepped out, his breath thick with whiskey. He said nothing further. One hand seized her throat. The other drove into her already bruised jaw. She dropped onto the icy stone, her head striking the cold railing. Marlon leaned down, his voice a low and contemptuous whisper. "You really think anyone but me still wants to look at this body?" Then he straightened his cufflinks and walked back inside as though nothing had happened. Nyla crawled toward the dark corner behind a large potted evergreen. Her dress was soaked through the cold, cutting to the bone. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling so badly she had to dial twice. She called a number she had sworn 3 years ago she would never use again. The number of a mafia boss she had once loved enough to leave, because loving him had felt like its own kind of danger. It rang twice. A man's voice answered low and even, without greeting. "Nyla?" She said only 4 words, her voice breaking. "Can you come get me?" For 3 years, Nyla had told herself that choosing an ordinary life meant choosing safety, but ordinary had cost her more than danger ever did. It had cost her her body, her voice, her sense of being worth defending. In this moment, her fear of Marlon finally became smaller than her fear of disappearing entirely. That is why she didn't call the police, or her mother, or a friend. She called the one person who had never once asked her to be smaller. The instant the call connected, her screen lit with an automated message from that same number, from Isaiah Banks himself. Signal activated. Team en route. No further words required. He hadn't only left her his number 3 years ago. He had built a single door into her old life and left it unlocked on the chance she ever needed to walk back through it, and never once tried to open it himself. Her battery read 4%. She checked the time 8 minutes before Marlon would come looking for her again. She sat curled behind the planter, watching rainwater pool and catch the warm gold light spilling from the party inside, while her own body went numb and aching in the cold. Nyla looked down into that puddle and whispered to herself, barely audible beneath the rain. "Not this time. I'm not running anymore." What was waiting in those 8 minutes would change everything, and it was already on its way. 20 minutes away, in the basement of an upscale restaurant in Boston's North End, Isaiah Banks sat across from a debtor, kneeling on a sheet of plastic tarp. The tattoos winding around his neck and down his right forearm caught the dim yellow light. To most of Boston, he was simply the Mafia boss no one crossed twice. A private phone on the table buzzed. Isaiah glanced at the number, said nothing, and simply raised one hand. Calvin Bishop hauled the debtor out without a word. Isaiah rose his voice flat and cold. 3 cars. Bring Autumn Franklin. Full kit for a jaw injury and a woman's body. Calvin was already at the door when he added the rest. Boss, the team watching Griffin's finances has had eyes on that club for 2 weeks now. They're already 3 minutes out. Isaiah had not been waiting on a phone call. He'd been quietly building a case against Marlon Griffin's embezzlement for months for reasons that had nothing to do with Nyla at all. And tonight, that patience was about to pay for itself twice over. Back at the country club, Marlon Griffin stepped outside a second time, his voice honey-sweet and false. "Baby, I was only joking. Come on back in. They're about to cut the cake." Nyla almost stepped forward, out of fear alone, but the memory of the older woman's words and the fist that had followed it pulled her deeper into the shadows. She bit down on her bottom lip until it bled. 3 black Rolls-Royce Cullinans tore up the club's drive exactly 11 minutes after the call had ended. Their headlights sliced through the rain like blades of white light. Marlon was still standing there laughing, waving guests back inside when the car doors opened. Isaiah Banks stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. His black suit soaked through instantly, the tattoos on his neck and forearm gleaming with water. His gray eyes fixed only on the dark corner where Nyla was hiding. He did not look at Marlon, not for a single second. His voice, low and clear, cut straight through the rain. "Nyla, come out." The moment the car door shut behind them, Calvin Bishop glanced into the rearview mirror and murmured to Isaiah, "Boss, 2 unfamiliar cars just pulled up to the back gate." Who they belonged to, no one in that car yet knew, and the answer would matter more than any of them expected. Marlon still thinks tonight is about him. It isn't. Team Isaiah or Team Marlon? Who do you think is walking into more danger right now? Drop a 1 for Isaiah or a 2 for Marlon in the comments. Isaiah did not lunge for Marlon. He crossed the wet stone courtyard, dropped to one knee directly in the filthy puddle in front of Nyla, and pulled off his own cashmere coat, laying it gently across her trembling shoulders. His voice was quiet enough for only the 2 of them to hear. "I'm sorry it took me 3 years to get here." Behind them, Marlon shouted, "That's my wife! You people are breaking the law!" Isaiah rose and for the first time turned to face him. He drew a black USB drive from his inside pocket and dropped it at Marlon's feet. 2 years of your operating fund's embezzlement records, documented by people who've been watching your company a lot longer than you'd like. The FBI gets a copy at 6 tomorrow morning, if you're still standing here in 10 more seconds. Marlon's face went white. He stumbled backward. Nyla was helped into the car. The door closed. Warmth and a suffocating silence pressed in around her. Isaiah did not ask how she had been hurt. He simply handed her a cold compress and said, 3 years ago, you left because you wanted an ordinary life. I understood that. What I didn't understand was how many bruises you'd hidden just to hold on to that ordinary." He touched the console screen gently. A photograph appeared, the angle unmistakably the hallway outside Nyla's old bedroom. In the blurred background stood the clear shape of Hope Ellis, watching the scene unfold, before quietly turning away and closing the door. "Dr. Franklin has been keeping careful records on you for 2 years at my request, through channels that never once put your name at risk," Isaiah said. "But this last photograph isn't hers. It's one of 7 someone else has sent me anonymously over the past 8 months." Nyla stared at the image, her entire body going rigid. "Your sister saw," Isaiah said quietly. "She never told your parents to stop it, but she never stopped sending me proof either. She just never found the courage to stand between you and them in the daylight." Hope's silence was never cruelty. It was survival, inside a family that rewarded compliance and punished anyone who spoke first. Sending the photographs was the only rebellion she knew how to make without losing her own place at that table. Her real fear wasn't Marlon. It was becoming the next daughter her parents decided to erase. That fear kept her hands moving in secret long after her voice had gone quiet in public. Tears ran down Nyla's face, though no sound came with them. Isaiah shut off the screen, his voice low and steady. "Now you know why I never trust blood to protect what it claims to love." The car sat quiet, the console's fading light slipping off Nyla's bruised, swollen face, while outside the rain kept falling and the lights of the country club still burned bright as though nothing at all had happened. Isaiah looked straight ahead and said something that made the air inside the car turn to ice. "Those 2 strange cars back there, they weren't Marlon's people." He didn't say who they belonged to yet. He only made one call, gave a single clipped instruction, and hung up, enough to tell Nyla that whatever was coming next had been set in motion long before tonight, and that a Mafia boss's silence could sometimes carry more weight than his rage. For 3 days afterward, Nyla barely spoke. She sat by the tall windows of Isaiah's penthouse in Back Bay, watching frost gather over the public garden below, her jaw wrapped in gauze, her wrists still marked where Marlon's grip had closed too hard. Dr. Autumn Franklin came twice a day, her manner clinical and precise, though her hands were gentler than Nyla expected each time. She never asked questions Nyla didn't want to answer. She only checked the swelling, adjusted the medication, and said once, quietly, before leaving, "You're healing faster than most people I've seen come through that door." It was the closest thing to comfort Nyla had been offered in years that didn't come wrapped in some kind of condition. Isaiah gave her space without ever truly leaving her alone. He worked in the next room, with the door left open close enough that she could hear the low murmur of his voice on calls she wasn't meant to understand, far enough that she never felt watched. Twice she woke from shallow, frightened sleep to find he had simply moved a chair nearer the window, saying nothing, only sitting with a folder of paperwork balanced on his knee until she drifted off again. It was not the kind of protection she had ever known before. It asked nothing of her in return. Whatever those 2 cars had meant, they were about to find out, and the answer would reach far closer to home than Nyla could have imagined. 3 days after the night of her rescue inside the high-rise penthouse in Back Bay, overlooking a public garden dusted with frost, Nyla Price's jaw had begun to heal, though the bruise still bloomed yellow and violet beneath her eye. That morning, she stood at the kitchen island in one of Isaiah's borrowed sweaters, watching Rosa, the housekeeper, pour 2 cups of coffee without ever asking whether one was enough. Steam curled up into the cold light slanting through the windows. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the low, even murmur of Isaiah's voice on a call. Not the words, just the rhythm of it, steady as a metronome. And she'd noticed these past 3 days that the sound of it no longer made her flinch. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug and let herself notice for the first time in years that her hands weren't shaking. Her mind drifted unbidden to the week before the wedding, Her father pulling her aside in the garage, smelling of scotch and aftershave, telling her that Marlon's family had connections worth protecting, and that she should stop asking so many questions about the money end of things. She hadn't understood it then. She told herself it was just her father being her father, practical, cold, uninterested in her feelings unless they inconvenienced him. She hadn't let herself wonder what exactly he meant by protecting. She set the coffee down suddenly, not thirsty anymore. Her new phone rang. Hope Ellis was calling, her voice breaking. In the background, Nyla could hear the faint rustle of the wedding garlands still hanging in their parents' front hall, not yet taken down. And somewhere beneath that, the television. Always the television in that house. Marlon says you were kidnapped by some criminal. Mom and Dad are drawing up intervention papers. They're saying you're not thinking clearly anymore. Nyla's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles paled again, the same way they had in the rain outside the club. But this time her jaw didn't clench in fear. It clenched in something closer to resolve. Nyla didn't offer a long explanation. She sent a single clear photograph instead. Her swollen jaw, the bruised ring around her wrist, her eyes staring directly into the camera. The line went silent for exactly 12 seconds. She could hear Hope breathing on the other end, quick and shallow, like someone trying not to cry and failing anyway. When Hope finally spoke, her voice had gone very small. I didn't know it was that bad. Nyla said nothing back. She simply ended the call, set the phone face down on the counter, and watched the steam rise off her coffee until it stopped. That same night, the lobby's security camera caught Marlon Griffin arriving with 4 men in dark clothing sleeves bulging where handguns sat holstered beneath. Marlon didn't knock. He stood in the center of the lobby, raised his phone, and started a live stream in full view of the doorman and several residents. Marble floor, gold light fixtures, a dozen phone screens lifting around him like a second audience gathering behind the first. His voice cracked with practiced grief. My wife's been kidnapped by some gangster. She's been mentally unstable for years. Please, somebody help me. Within 11 minutes, the video passed 40,000 views. Relatives, old co-workers, even guests from Hope's wedding watched it unfold in real time. Nyla's reputation and any chance of returning to a quiet, ordinary life burned away in public with a single live stream. Isaiah Banks didn't go down to the lobby. He only looked at the screen and said one line to Calvin Bishop. Handle it clean. No blood on the carpet. His eyes never left the feed as he said it, and Calvin was already moving before the sentence finished, the way a man moves when he's rehearsed the order in his head 100 times before it was ever given. The 4 armed men were subdued in under 90 seconds. Marlon was taken out through the loading entrance before a single police unit arrived. At a private property Isaiah's organization used outside the city, Marlon was brought to kneel on a bare concrete floor. Somewhere overhead, a generator hummed, and the single flashlight beam Calvin held cut a hard white circle across the concrete, leaving everything outside it in shadow. Isaiah sat across from him in a folding chair, the tattoos on his neck and forearm catching the beam of light. The same calm, unhurried presence that had made him the most feared Mafia boss north of Providence. Marlon's breathing had gone ragged, visible in short white clouds in the cold air, and his hands, when he pressed them flat against his knees, would not stop trembling. Nyla's voice came through the earpiece Isaiah had deliberately kept open so she could hear everything. You don't need to ask him anything else. I recorded 14 conversations over the past 2 years. I never had the courage to send them. I do now. Isaiah glanced once at his phone before he pressed play. A flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Not hesitation exactly, but the recognition that even he didn't fully know what these 14 recordings held, and that whatever came next belonged to Nyla, not to him. The 9th recording played aloud. Marlon's drunken voice rang out clearly. I married her because her father holds 18% of the Boston port shares. Once the paperwork transferred, I was going to make her disappear. But the hardest blow came in the 12th recording, the unmistakable voice of Nyla's own father accepting $200,000 to keep the girl in line and keep her quiet. On the other end of the line, in the quiet of the penthouse, Nyla sat very still on the couch with one hand pressed flat against her mouth. Autumn Franklin, who had come by to check her vitals and simply never left, sat beside her without a word, one hand resting lightly on Nyla's back, not comforting exactly, just present, the way a hand rests on a railing before a long fall. The air went dense and still. Marlon collapsed forward onto the concrete. On the other end of the line, Nyla's voice didn't break. She only said very softly, I've heard enough. Isaiah switched off the recorder, looked down at the trembling man before him, and asked quietly, That stake, who does it belong to now? Marlon didn't answer. He didn't need to. Isaiah already knew, and by morning so would every lawyer his people had waiting. He let Marlon go that same night, stripped of his claim to the port shares, warned in a single sentence never to come near Nyla again, and reminded that the USB drive still existed. Marlon disappeared from view after that. Nyla didn't ask where. Isaiah didn't tell her he'd never actually promised him silence forever, only that Marlon wouldn't be a problem for now. By morning, the story had already reached local news desks, in fragments, an anonymous tip here, a leaked clip there, though none of it yet carried Nyla's name. She watched it unfold from the penthouse window with a strange, hollow calm. The same calm she'd worn for years while absorbing far worse in silence. The difference now was that the silence had ended. Autumn Franklin checked her vitals that afternoon and noted without particular emotion that Nyla's blood pressure had finally dropped into a normal range for the first time since she'd begun treating her, as though some part of her body had only now understood it was allowed to stop bracing for the next blow. Isaiah didn't celebrate. He rarely did. He simply sat across from her with 2 cups of tea neither of them touched and said, None of this erases what happened to you. It only makes sure it stops happening. Nyla turned the words over for a long moment before answering. I know. I don't need it erased. I just needed it to be true out loud, where everyone could hear it. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the tea going cold between his hands. My mother sold information about me to a rival family when I was 9 years old, he said, so evenly it took Nyla a second to understand what he'd said at all. Not because she hated me, because the money mattered more that week than I did. I was young enough to forgive her for it. I was old enough later never to forget it. He looked up. That's the only inheritance I ever kept from her, knowing exactly what blood is worth and what it isn't. Nyla reached over and covered his hand with hers, and for once, neither of them needed to say anything else. He nodded once, as though that was the only answer he'd been waiting for. 2 weeks passed. The bruising across Nyla's face had faded to a pale yellow. She'd begun taking early morning walks around the public garden, with Isaiah Calvin always trailing a respectful distance behind, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold. Some mornings, Nyla would stop at the same bench overlooking the frozen pond, and Isaiah would simply stand beside her, saying nothing, letting the silence be a comfortable one instead of a held breath. Once she caught herself laughing, really laughing, at Calvin's flat insistence that he did not, under any circumstances, enjoy feeding the ducks, even as he emptied an entire bag of bread into the water. It startled her how unfamiliar the sound of her own laughter felt in her chest, like a muscle she hadn't used in years, remembering how to move. On one of those mornings, a black sedan idled a little too long at the corner across from the building, And Calvin noted it without comment, the way he noted most things now, quietly, and only once. Nyla thought nothing of it at the time. She would think of it again in 15 days. On the evening of the 15th day, the penthouse doorbell rang. Hope Ellis stood outside with their parents and 2 lawyers in dark suits. They hadn't come to apologize. Hope wouldn't meet Nyla's eyes. She stood half a step behind their parents, arms crossed tight over her chest, and when the door opened, her mouth moved as if she meant to say something, before her mother's voice cut cleanly over hers. On the glass table, they laid out a thick folder, a guardianship petition already filed with the county probate court, arguing Nyla had lost capacity and was under the control of a criminal element. A single signed refusal on the record, the lawyers explained, was the only thing standing between the petition and a judge. The overhead lights caught the folder's edges, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper and the wind pressing against the balcony glass. Nyla's father looked directly at Isaiah Banks and spoke in a tone meant as a threat. "If you let the girl come home, we won't press kidnapping charges. If you don't, every paper in Boston will have your photo with her by morning." For the first time, Isaiah found himself publicly cornered by the very family of the woman he'd sworn to protect, and he said nothing at all, because this wasn't his fight to finish. It was hers. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his eyes moving once to Nyla and staying there, waiting, ready to move only if she asked him to. Nyla stood listening to all of it. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to the table. The glass was cold beneath her fingertips when she reached for the pen, and for one long second, she thought of every dinner table where her opinion had been decided before she'd opened her mouth, every holiday photograph where she'd learned to stand toward the back. She picked up the pen and signed the refusal directly in front of her parents, her sister, and both lawyers. Then she set the pen down and said in a voice completely calm, "As of today, I am no longer your daughter." With a single signature, she severed every remaining thread of blood between them. For years, Nyla's deepest wound was never Marlon's fists. It was the quiet certainty that her own family had already decided she was worth less than their comfort. Signing that paper wasn't rage. It was the final refusal to keep auditioning for love from people who had already voted against her. In that moment, her fear of being truly alone finally lost to her refusal to be small again. And that is the exact instant she stopped surviving her life and started choosing it. Hope sank into a chair, sobbing. Their parents went pale. The lawyers gathered the folder in silence. When the door closed behind them, the penthouse held nothing but the sound of wind against the balcony glass. Isaiah didn't move to comfort her right away. He simply stood a few feet off, giving her the room she needed to feel the weight of what she'd just done settle over her before it turned into relief. When she finally exhaled, it came out shaking, but her shoulders had already begun to drop from around her ears, an inch at a time, like something unclenching after years held tight. Her phone buzzed once, an hour later. A text from Hope. "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago." Nyla read it twice, then set the phone face down on the table, the way she had the night of the first call, and didn't answer. Some doors, she was learning, could stay closed without needing to be slammed. In the days that followed, the penthouse settled into a strange, unfamiliar quiet, the kind Nyla had never once experienced inside her own family's house, where every silence used to feel like a held breath before the next cruelty. Here, silence simply meant safety. She began sleeping longer. She began cautiously to laugh at small things. A burnt piece of toast, Calvin's flat refusal to admit he liked the movie playing in the background, Autumn's dry commentary during checkups. She started wearing her own clothes again, instead of borrowed sweaters, choosing colors she'd once been told didn't suit a figure like hers.
No one in that penthouse ever once suggested she should take up less space.
Isaiah watched all of this from a careful distance, never pushing, never demanding gratitude for what he'd done. One evening, as she stood at the window watching the garden lights flicker on below, he set a folder of finalized legal documents on the table beside her. A trust, holding the 18% stake in the Boston port, quietly established in her name years earlier without her knowledge, as a private safeguard he'd never once used to control her. "It's yours to decide what happens with it now," he told her. "Not mine, not theirs. Yours." It was, Nyla realized, the first time in her adult life anyone had handed her real power and asked nothing of her in return. On Christmas night, snow fell heavily over Commonwealth Avenue. Inside the penthouse, the electric fireplace burned warm and steady, and the smell of pine from a small tree Rosa had set up in the corner mixed with the low simmer of mulled wine no one had gotten around to pouring. Somewhere behind them, a record played something slow and low, more felt than listened to. Nyla Price wore a deep red velvet dress for the first time fitted to every curve of her body, with no jacket layered over it to soften or hide her shape. She stood at the tall window watching the snow fall, her reflection ghosted faintly over the dark glass. Isaiah Banks walked in from his study. His white shirt was open at the collar, the tattoos at his neck and a long part of his forearm visible in the firelight. He crossed the room, knelt on one knee on the walnut floor before her, and opened a small black velvet box. His hands, usually so still, weren't quite steady this time, and Nyla noticed it before she noticed the ring, the one visible tremor she had ever seen in a man who commanded a room without raising his voice. Inside the box sat a ring set with a deep black diamond. He said, "You don't have to wear it if you're not ready, but I want the world to know you're mine to protect." Nyla lifted the ring and studied the tiny engraving inside the band. Semper. She asked, softly, "How long have you had this?" Isaiah answered without hesitation, "Since the morning after you left. I had it made the day I woke up and you were gone." Across the room, Calvin had gone very quiet, his phone in hand, glancing at the screen every few minutes in a way he hadn't all evening, a small, restless habit neither of them noticed in the warmth of the moment. She was leaning down to kiss him when Calvin Bishop's phone began ringing without pause. At the same moment, every television in the penthouse switched on to the same channel. At 9:17 p.m., every Boston news station aired in the same instant Marlon Griffin's old live stream footage, cut together with recordings of his own voice, admitting to fraud. Immediately after came footage confirming the 18% stake in the Boston port had for years been legally secured in Nyla Price's name through a private trust, never touched, never spent, waiting. Marlon was arrested live on air. Nyla's father was summoned for questioning. Hope wept in front of the cameras, her hands pressed over her mouth exactly the way Nyla's had been 2 weeks earlier. But the greatest shock hadn't arrived yet. Isaiah rose to his feet, looked directly into Nyla's eyes, and spoke low and steady without a trace of hesitation. "I didn't just save you. I need you. Because only with you alive and standing beside me does that 18% stay out of every enemy's reach. You're not someone who needs protecting anymore, Nyla. You're the one piece that keeps this whole empire from ever being torn down." Everything that had come before, she understood now, had only been the foundation. Tonight, she wasn't simply rescued. She was being lifted into a place of equal power beside the very Mafia boss the whole city once feared as a monster. Nyla looked at him for a long moment. Then she slid the ring onto her left hand, the black diamond catching the firelight like something quietly burning, and said clearly,
Then never call me someone who needs protecting again.
Their final kiss no longer carried the weight of rescue. It was a declaration. Outside Boston remained loud and dangerous, the same as it had always been. Inside the penthouse, for the first time in more years than she could count, Nyla Price fell asleep without locking her bedroom door. Not because she was being guarded, but because she had become part of the power that guarded everything else. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't retire just because a marriage, a career, or a family already has. Nyla's real victory wasn't the mansion or the ring. It was the morning she finally stopped waiting for people who'd already decided not to show up for her. If you're widowed, or your children have grown distant, or a marriage left you smaller than you started, that ache is real, and no one gets to tell you it should already be gone by now. But healing isn't a feeling you wait for. It's a few small, ordinary choices repeated. This week, call the one friend who never once made you feel like too much. Write down, on actual paper, 3 people who have shown you real loyalty and 3 who haven't, so your heart stops confusing the two. If a doctor's visit or a legal document has been sitting untouched because it felt like too much to face alone, ask one person to sit beside you while you open it. You don't need an empire to reclaim your worth. You need one honest conversation, one boundary spoken out loud, one morning where you choose yourself first. That's how quiet women become powerful. Not all at once, but one refusal at a time. Now it's your turn. Did Nyla make the right choice walking away from her family? Yes or no? Tell us below. And if her story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories of quiet women who finally rise.